Lengthy books on the history and theory of comics have shown me that this short video cannot possibly claim to cover everything. Included here, then, are comic book cultures that have been most successful commercially, those with the greatest cultural influence, and the ones that I've been personally exposed to, which for the most part intersect with the first two categories. As such, we'll be looking at American comics and the emergence of the superhero, Japanese manga, Franco-Belgian Bande Déssinée, and the Amar Chitra Katha comic series from India. Among these disparate cultures, a recurring theme will be the struggle for legitimacy. Are comic books low art for the masses or high art comparable to the most respected painting and literature? But before we start that, we'll take a brief look at the conventions of comic books and how they communicate with readers. Anne Miller cites Fresno Durel as describing part of the appeal of the comic being the tension between three-dimensional, quote, scenographic cubes, unquote, and the two-dimensional page. She also mentions Gronstein's theory, which asserts that certain panels have more narrative significance than others. For example, the bottom right corner, which adds a level of suspense because the reader can't see the next panel. MacLean cites Barry, 1997, in the way the depiction of images affects the narrative. For example, the importance of facial expressions of the characters. There are 5 types of text in comics, enumerated here in order of least to most integrated into the story. The paratext is the title, used on the cover page, and perhaps the leaf. It is usually in typeset characters, but not in this example. 2 is the recitatif, or narrative voice. 3A, 3B, and 3C are all dialogue boxes, each with their own function. Generally, the bigger a dialogue box, the louder it is. 4 is an onomatopoeic sound that is as much part of the picture as it is the text. 5th, the most integrated, is text that occurs from within the fictional world, in this example, the Google text on the computer. There's a bit of a dispute among comic book historians about whether the father of modern comics was Rudolf Topfer of Switzerland with Histoire de Monsieur Vieuxbois in 1827, or Richard Ucko, an American who created The Yellow Kid and his new phonograph in 1896. Topfer created the panel-to-panel narrative structure of the modern comic book with captions below, while Ucko is credited with inventing the speech bubble. Of course, there are earlier works, like the engravings of William Hogarth starting in the 1730s, early forms of manga, like this image dating back to the 1200s, comic-like depictions of Hindu gods and goddesses, like this one from around 1770, and European religious work dating back to the Middle Ages that incorporated text with image. The aforementioned Yellow Kid, or Hogan's Alley, it actually started without a name, depicted slum life in New York City and appeared in newspapers. When it did well, newspaper publishers all over the United States recognized the potential for comics to increase sales, and comic strips caught on around the nation. Pulp magazines became popular around the same time as newspaper comics, and eventually the two gave birth to the comic book. The famous funnies started up in 1929, and detective comics soon followed. These were crime stories featuring mortal men with supernatural abilities. Action Comics #1, featuring Superman, came out in 1938, and that changed everything. Drawn in Cleveland by Toronto-born Joe Shuster and written by his partner Jerry Siegel, it had been rejected by several newspapers when they tried Superman as a comic strip. Eventually, they were paid $10 per page and sold their rights to Detective Comics for $65 each. The era starting with Superman is known as the Golden Age. The stories were usually about common people as victims to those in power, with the superheroes leveling the playing field. Soon other comic book companies like Marvel sprang up, and while teens were still the main audience, the genre diversified to include romance comics to attract female readers. There was also Wonder Woman, created in 1941 by William Moulton Marston, who declared her to be, quote, psychological propaganda for the new type of woman who, I believe, should rule the world, unquote. Marston's private life, living polyamorously with 3 women, is a fascinating side story in the history of comics. Scholars like Emily Greenhouse and Jill Lepore question Wonder Woman's place in feminist history, given Marston's personal story. During World War II, American comics took up the cause of patriotism by having superheroes fighting against German and Japanese bad guys. Canadian comics flourished as well during this time due to the War Exchange Conservation Act, which disallowed the import of non-essential goods like comic books from the United States. This allowed for superheroes like Nelvana of the Northern Lights, a female superhero who actually predates Wonder Woman. Back in the States, the comic book genre soon found enemies among the elite or traditionalists. Much like crusades against rock, rap, and video games, Dr. Frederick Wortham led a movement to censor comic books just after World War II. Horror and crime comics rose in popularity during this latter stage of the Golden Age because superheroes no longer had the war to provide them with enemies. Concern from parents, churches, and government also rose. Wortham found a correlation between these especially violent comic books and youth delinquency, so he wrote 2 papers which turned much of the public against comic books. This led to a new association of comic book publishers establishing a code. They came up with a seal of approval for comic books considered to be within the parameters of good taste. This regulation, an oversaturated comic book market, and the rise of television all contributed to the end of the Golden Age and a relegation of American comic books from the mainstream to the underground. In Japan, manga has long been mainstream. Manga is usually black and white, more image than text, and are mostly considered disposable rather than collectible. Like the Japanese language, they're read from right to left. Manga comprises about 1/3 of all publishing output and revenue in Japan and covers almost every conceivable subject matter. The earliest roots of manga go back to hand scrolls that combined text and images, with this example dating back to the 8th century. In the 1600s, a new manga became popular among the merchant classes. They were made with woodblock printing. They culminated in the iconic works of Hokusai, who lived from around 1760 to 1849. The father of modern manga is Osamu Tezuka, who created Atom Boy and Treasure Island. Highly influenced by Fritz Lang's Metropolis and by Walt Disney, Tezuka considered manga to be a merging of Japanese and Western culture. Having written more than 150,000 pages, Tezuka is a huge figure in Japan. Mark Dennis comments here on the process of turning ancient Buddhist texts into manga. Considered to be the 9th art in France, the first is architecture, then sculpture, painting, music, etc., Bande Déssinée has long been taken more seriously than comic books have in the US. In fact, arguments for the legitimacy of the medium go all the way back to Topfer, who wrote in his Essai de Physiognomie, "You can write stories with chapters, lines, and words. It is literature in the proper sense. You can write stories with a succession of graphically represented scenes. It is literature in stamps." In France, imported comics from America during the Golden Age were very popular, so like manga, Bande Déssinée is considered to be a hybrid of homegrown and American culture. Hergé's Tintin began in 1929 in a Catholic newspaper in Brussels, and though early work was fraught with anti-Semitism and horribly racist depictions of Africans, Tintin grew through many phases into a more sophisticated product, eventually aimed more at adults than children. A great contribution was Ligne Claire, a graphic style pioneered by Hergé. After the war and into the classical period of Bande Déssinée, there were 2 primary schools. L'École de Bruxelles included Hergé, Paul Cuvelier, Jacques Martin, and Willy van der Steen. L'École de Charleroi included André Fraquin, Giget, and Peyo, the creator of the Smurfs. René Goscinny and Alberto Uderzo created Astérix and Obélix in Pilote magazine in 1959. After Astérix appeared on the cover of L'Express in 1966, Astérix chez les Bretons sold 600,000 copies within 2 weeks of its release. By the late 60s, we see a great self-awareness emerging in Bande Déssinée and a blurring of lines between the real world and the fictional one, as seen in this image from Achille Talon by Greg. But even in France, the art form had its detractors. Finally, it's worth mentioning that Charlie Mensuel, which eventually became Charlie Hebdo, grew out of this period of Bande Déssinée. It's clear from the massive outpouring of support that we saw in the news after the shootings last January that the irreverence displayed by their brand of Bande Déssinée has become an entrenched part of French culture. Amar Chitra comics informed me about the history and culture of a place that was in my blood but on the other side of Earth from where I grew up. Carleen MacLean affirms that I was not the only child of Indian descent living abroad who learned about India through these comic books. ACK was the brainchild of Anant Pai. While working at the Times of India, he reprinted American comics like Tarzan, The Phantom, and Mandrake the Magician in the early to mid-60s, but started dreaming about a homegrown comic industry. He felt that while Indian kids in English medium schools were learning about Greek mythology, they were lacking stories about Indian history and mythology, and as a result becoming too westernized. So, like Tezuka in Japan and the early schools of Bande Déssinée, Pai married the largely American medium with traditional stylization. For Pai, this was particularly true in the depiction of Hindu gods. In 1967, ACK was born and published its first Hindu-themed comic, Krishna, in 1969. India is a nation of incredibly diversity in terms of language, culture, and religion, though it is about 80% Hindu. While ACK did publish comics featuring other religions like Sikh, Muslim, and Buddhist comics shown here, and claimed to represent all Indians, MacLean and other scholars she cites, such as Francis Pritchett and John Stratton Hawley, beg to differ. Hawley is cited by MacLean for his assertion back in 1995 that readers of Amar Chitra Katha are not likely to be able to disentangle Hinduness from Indianness with any ease. Other scholars, such as Nandini Chandra, felt that ACK welcomed Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, and Dalits into the Hindu family, but purposefully marginalized Muslims. MacLean also cites Aruna Rao in her concerns about sexism and caste discrimination in the series. MacLean echoed these concerns in her 2008 paper about Tales of Durga, written in 1978. According to MacLean, Pai and others around him were uncomfortable with the martial aspect of Durga's character and sought ways to diminish it by, among other slights, not introducing her until the 6th page of her own comic book. Like comic book artists of other countries and artists in general, Pai struggled with questions of commercial value versus staying true to his own artistic vision. And as this struggle exists, it would follow that comic books are indeed an art form. David Rapp and others in the field of education have also helped to legitimize comics with their acknowledgement of their pedagogical value.